There's a specific type of person you meet and immediately recognize. They never ask for help. They assume the worst will happen and plan accordingly. They parent like their own children might disappear if they blink. And when you ask about their childhood, they shrug and say something like, "We just figured it out," as if raising yourself at age 7 was completely normal. If you were born in the 1970s, you are the least parented generation in American history. That's not an exaggeration. That's documented fact. Between 1960 and 1980, the divorce rate more than doubled. By the mid-1970s, half of you had watched your parents split up. 40% of you were latchkey kids, coming home to empty houses with keys strung around your necks, microwaving your own dinners, doing homework alone, waiting for parents who were working late or just gone. You were called day orphans in a 1984 documentary. The least nurtured generation. The children whose parents were so focused on their own self-exploration that you became obstacles they worked around rather than lives they centered. And that abandonment, because that's what it was, didn't just shape your childhood. It built the psychology you're still operating from today. Picture yourself at 8 years old. It's 1978, maybe 1981. Your parents sit you down. They're getting divorced. You don't fully understand what that means yet, but you will. No-fault divorce laws passed in 1969. By the time you were old enough to remember, your friends' parents were splitting up left and right. Unlike today, joint custody wasn't standard. Only 9 U.S. states allowed it in the 1970s. So when your parents divorced, you lost a parent. Usually your father. He moved out. You saw him every other weekend if you were lucky. And that was just normal. One writer who lived through it described her suburb as littered with sad-eyed, bruised nomads who wandered back and forth between used record shops to the sheds behind the train station where they got high, then trudged off, back and forth from their mother's houses during the week to their father's apartments every other weekend. That's not poetry. That's your actual childhood. Splitting time between homes that never quite felt like home. Watching one parent try to rebuild, while the other disappeared into a new life that didn't include you. And nobody, not teachers, not counselors, not relatives, talked about what that does to a kid. It taught you that people leave, that commitment is conditional, that you can't depend on anyone but yourself. Those aren't lessons you chose to learn. They're scars that hardened into survival instincts. Then there was the key, that actual physical key on a string or a lanyard around your neck. Your badge of independence, your symbol of abandonment. Between 1969 and 1996, the number of working mothers doubled. Many were single moms who had no choice. They were out there, trying to survive in an economy hit by 1970s hyperinflation, while raising kids alone. But the result for you was the same. You came home from school to silence. You let yourself in, locked the door behind you, called your mom at work to tell her you made it home safe. Then you were alone, for hours, during what law enforcement calls the danger zone, 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., the window when unsupervised kids are most vulnerable. Some of you handled it fine. You did your homework, watched TV, made yourself a snack. Others? You got into things you shouldn't have, explored cabinets, found things you weren't ready to find. Or worse, you let people in who shouldn't have been there, because you were 8 years old and nobody had taught you what to do when a stranger knocked. The effects varied. Some latchkey kids just watched too much TV. Others fell into escalating patterns, experimenting with drugs, alcohol, sex, way too young. One woman from Oklahoma recounted coming home unsupervised and doing things I wasn't supposed to do, taking care of her younger sister when she could barely take care of herself, making adult decisions in a child's body. But here's the thing, none of this was talked about. You didn't complain. You didn't tell anyone you were scared or lonely or overwhelmed, because your parents were already stressed, and you learned early that your needs were a burden. So you became self-reliant, fiercely independent. You figured out how to cook, how to get yourself to activities, how to solve problems. Not because those are character-building experiences, because you had no other choice. And then there were the catastrophes, the ones that confirmed your worst suspicions about how fragile everything is. You watched 3 Mile Island nearly melt down in 1979. Nuclear disaster wasn't theoretical. It was happening in Pennsylvania, and nobody knew if it would spread. Chernobyl followed in 1986. broadcast on the news while you ate dinner. Images of children with radiation burns seared into your developing brain. Then came the Challenger explosion in 1986. They made you watch it live in school. Teachers gathered everyone around the TV to witness history. And you did. You watched 7 astronauts die in real time, watched the shuttle disintegrate, watched adults who had promised this was safe stand there in shock with no idea what to say to a room full of traumatized children. That's when you learned adults lie. They tell you things are safe when they're not. They promise you're protected when you're not. And when disaster strikes, they can't save you. These weren't isolated incidents. Bhopal in 1984, the world's deadliest industrial accident. The collapse of job security as downsizing entered the American vocabulary in the 1980s. Your parents losing jobs to corporate restructuring, Enron, Wall Street excess, everything proving that institutions you're told to trust will fail you. So you stopped trusting. You became skeptical, cynical, not because you wanted to be negative, because experience taught you that optimism gets punished. Now look at you today. You swore you'd never do to your kids what was done to you. You'd be present, attentive, protective, and you are. You're helicopter parents. You track their phones. You know where they are every second. You don't let them walk to school alone. You don't let them stay home unsupervised. You hover. You micromanage. You control. Because deep down, you're still that 8-year-old coming home to an empty house, terrified something bad will happen, and nobody will be there to save you. So you refuse to let your kids feel that. Ever. But there's a cost. Your kids aren't developing the independence you had. They can't handle discomfort. They panic when things go wrong. They call you to solve problems they should handle themselves. And you watch this happening, confused about how your constant presence somehow created the fragility you were trying to prevent. Here's what 40 to 50 years of that childhood created. You're independent to the point of isolation. You don't ask for help even when you're drowning, because asking for help means admitting you can't handle it. And you learned young that nobody's coming to save you anyway. You're hyper-vigilant, always watching for the next disaster, the next betrayal, the next person who's going to leave. You prepare for the worst because the worst kept happening. 3 Mile Island, Challenger, your parents' divorce, every promise that turned out to be a lie. You're brutally honest, transparent to the point where younger generations think you're mean, but you're not trying to be cruel. You're just allergic to bullshit. Because you grew up watching adults lie about everything. About marriages being fine when they weren't, about nuclear plants being safe when they weren't, about the world being a certain way when it absolutely wasn't. And you're exhausted. 50 years of self-reliance. 50 years of not depending on anyone. 50 years of carrying everything yourself because nobody taught you there was another way. If you're a 70s baby, you survived something that shouldn't have happened. You were children who deserved protection, and instead got abandonment disguised as independence. That key around your neck wasn't a symbol of maturity, it was evidence of neglect. Coming home to empty houses at 7 wasn't character building, it was trauma. And the fact that you survived it doesn't mean it didn't damage you. You're not broken, but you were hurt. And that hurt shaped every relationship you've had since. Every time you refuse to ask for support, every time you assume people will leave, every time you overprotect your kids, because you can't shake the feeling that danger is always one moment away. You were the least parented generation, and you turned that abandonment into fierce self-sufficiency. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop wearing that independence like armor. To admit that you needed help then, and you might need it now. If this hit deeper than you expected, you're not alone. 70s babies have carried this in silence for decades. This channel is for people with stories nobody else tells. Subscribe to keep exploring the psychology behind who you became, and drop your birth year below. Let's find each other, because maybe it's time we stop pretending we figured it all out when we were just kids trying to survive.